When a Family Feud contestant mocked Steve Harvey's skin tone on live television, no one expected what would happen next. In an instant, the jovial atmosphere of America's favorite game show transformed into stunned silence. The player thought they could score easy laughs at Harvey's expense, but they had no idea who they were truly dealing with. What Steve did in response didn't just silence one person. It left millions of viewers speechless. The brilliant lights of the Family Feud studio beamed down as Steve Harvey commanded the stage with his trademark charisma and perfectly tailored suit. The audience was electric, riding waves of uncontrollable laughter as competing families battled for points and prizes. Harvey's booming voice and impeccable comedic timing had become the heartbeat of the show, transforming an ordinary game into must-see television. After hosting thousands of episodes and handling countless awkward answers, Steve thought he'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared him for the storm that was about to erupt on his own stage. "I've got a good one for you, Steve," said the contestant with a smirk that should have been the first warning sign. The man stood confidently, microphone in hand, clearly believing he was about to deliver comedy gold. The camera caught Harvey's welcoming smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners, completely unaware of the incoming ambush. The contestant had been playful all game, but something in his demeanor shifted subtly as he prepared to cross an invisible line. Then it happened. A casual, cutting remark about the darkness of Harvey's skin that sliced through the studio like a knife through warm butter. The words tumbled out with practiced ease, suggesting this wasn't the first time the contestant had used someone's appearance as ammunition for a cheap laugh. The comment hung in the air, toxic and heavy, as realization dawned on every face in the room. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a collective gasp that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the studio. Camera operators exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether to stay on Harvey or cut away to spare him the humiliation. Producers in the control room froze, fingers hovering over buttons, debating in frantic whispers whether to intervene. The contestants' own family members visibly recoiled, creating physical distance from the verbal grenade their relative had just tossed. Their faces contorted in a mixture of embarrassment and horror. Steve Harvey stood motionless at his podium, his broad shoulders suddenly rigid under his suit jacket. His expression transformed from jovial host to something unreadable, a complex calculation happening behind his eyes. The microphone in his hand could have been made of lead for how heavily it seemed to weigh. This wasn't just a tasteless joke or an awkward game show moment. It was a direct challenge to his dignity on his own stage, broadcast to millions of homes across America. But what happened next would reveal a side of Steve Harvey that America never saw coming, a response so unexpected it would redefine his legacy forever. Long before the bright lights of Hollywood embraced him, Steve Harvey knew the sting of prejudice. Born in Welch, West Virginia in 1957, he entered a world where the color of his skin predetermined countless interactions. The man America would come to love as a charismatic host had first been a child who learned early that some people would see his complexion before they saw his humanity. Growing up in the segregated South during the Civil Rights era meant that lessons about race weren't abstract concepts, but daily realities that shaped his worldview from the ground up. As a young man driving through the South, Harvey had been pulled over for no reason other than driving while black. The humiliation of standing roadside while officers searched his vehicle without cause became a formative memory that would stay with him even as he acquired wealth and fame. As a struggling comedian living out of his car in the late 1980s, he'd heard the whispers about being too dark for mainstream success, with club owners sometimes suggesting he tone down his blackness to appeal to wider audiences. Even after climbing to the pinnacle of entertainment, becoming a household name with a media empire spanning radio, television, and publishing. The shadows of those experiences never fully receded from his consciousness. "I've had to fight twice as hard to get half as far," Harvey once confided in a rare, unguarded interview, his usual jovial demeanor momentarily replaced by a solemn reflection. And even when you make it, there's always someone waiting to remind you that they think you don't belong. Success doesn't shield you from racism. Sometimes it just changes how it's expressed. The glitz and glamour of television studios can create the illusion of a post-racial America. But Harvey knew better. Behind his million-dollar smile and perfect comedic timing lay the accumulated wisdom of navigating a world that hadn't always welcomed him. His success wasn't just about talent. It was about resilience, about absorbing blows and continuing forward with dignity intact. It was about transforming pain into purpose and finding ways to succeed in systems that weren't designed with him in mind. What viewers at home never saw were the private conversations with his children about how to handle racial slurs, the security measures at his home that spoke to lingering fears, or the careful calculation behind every public statement. They didn't witness the exhaustion that sometimes overcame him when the cameras stopped rolling. The weight of constantly being aware of how his words and actions might be perceived through the lens of race. Harvey had mastered the art of being authentically himself while remaining acutely aware of how he was perceived. His public persona, confident, commanding, charismatic, was both genuine and a carefully constructed armor designed to navigate the complex terrain of being a black man in the public eye. These experiences hadn't hardened Harvey. Rather, they'd given him an extraordinary emotional intelligence and empathy that informed everything from his comedy to his counsel on his talk show. The man who could read a contestant's discomfort from across the stage, who could put nervous families at ease with a well-timed joke, had developed these skills through necessity. He'd honed an almost supernatural ability to read a room, to understand the unspoken dynamics at play in any situation. Because for much of his life, this awareness had been essential for his survival and success. His journey from poverty to prosperity hadn't erased the memory of what it felt like to be judged by the shade of his skin rather than the content of his character. If anything, his platform had made him more aware of the responsibility he carried as a visible black man in America. Each achievement wasn't just a personal victory, but a statement that challenged stereotypes and opened doors for others who looked like him. So when that contestant unleashed the mockery about his skin tone, Harvey wasn't just processing a rude comment. He was accessing decades of similar moments, a lifetime of choices about how to respond to prejudice without losing himself in the process. The weight of his personal history, his public platform, and the millions watching at home, particularly young black viewers who might see themselves in him, all factored into the calculation happening behind his momentarily frozen expression. In that split second on stage, Steve had a choice that would define his legacy forever. He could laugh it off as many expected. He could respond with righteous anger as some might have justified. Or he could find a third path, one that would transform an ugly moment into something unexpectedly powerful. The studio remained frozen in that terrible silence. 5 seconds had passed since the contestant's remark, an eternity in television time. The show's director was moments away from calling for an emergency commercial break when Steve Harvey finally moved. He set his question cards down on the podium with deliberate care. The microphone picked up the soft sound as they touched the surface. When he looked up, the audience was startled by what they saw. There was no anger in his expression, no forced smile, no comedian's mask, just raw authenticity that television rarely captures. "You know," Harvey began, his voice lower and more measured than his usual animated delivery. "I could handle this a few different ways right now." The contestant's smirk began to falter as he realized the joke had landed differently than intended. "I could laugh it off and move on with the show," Harvey continued. "I could get angry and have you removed. Or I could do what I'm about to do, which is speak some truth." He stepped away from his podium, something he rarely did mid-game, and approached the contestant. The cameras followed, capturing every nuance of the unscripted moment. "That comment about my skin. I've heard versions of it my entire life, from schoolyards to comedy clubs to boardrooms. And here's what I've learned. When someone uses your appearance to try to diminish you, it says nothing about you and everything about them." The audience, initially tense with discomfort, began to murmur in agreement. The contestants' family members looked at the floor, their embarrassment palpable. "But here's where it gets interesting," Harvey said, his voice gaining strength without raising in volume. "I'm standing here today, successful, blessed, and proud of every inch of this skin. Because I decided long ago that other people's limitations wouldn't become mine." He turned slightly to address the wider audience, both in the studio and the millions watching at home. "This skin has been a blessing. It connects me to my ancestors who survived unimaginable hardship so I could stand here today. It's the same shade as my father's, who worked himself to exhaustion to give me opportunities he never had. This skin is my heritage, my legacy, and my strength." The studio audience began to applaud spontaneously, but Harvey raised a hand to indicate he wasn't finished. Turning back to the contestant, whose cockiness had completely evaporated, Harvey did something truly unexpected. He smiled. Not his television smile, but a genuine expression of compassion. "I'm not angry with you, man. But I am going to ask you something important. What made you think that comment was okay? What were you hoping would happen?" The power of the moment was in its gentleness. Harvey wasn't destroying the man. He was offering him a chance at redemption through reflection. The cameras captured the contestant's face as realization dawned. The understanding that he had been handed not punishment, but an opportunity for growth. The contestant stood frozen, microphone clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The studio lights seemed to intensify, highlighting beads of sweat forming on his forehead. For perhaps the first time in his life, he found himself completely stripped of the armor of humor he'd hidden behind for so long. The cameras that had once felt like allies now seemed accusatory, documenting a moment he desperately wished he could erase. I don't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible until Harvey gently gestured for the sound technician to boost his microphone. "I guess I thought it would be funny, that everyone would laugh." Harvey nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the honesty. That's how it starts, isn't it? We think certain jokes are harmless because we've heard them so often they seem normal. But there's always someone on the receiving end. The contestant's eyes darted around the studio, finding no escape from this unexpected reckoning. His family members, initially mortified, were now watching with a complex mixture of emotions. Embarrassment still evident, but also a dawning recognition of the rare opportunity unfolding before them. "My grandmother," the contestant suddenly blurted out, surprising even himself with the confession. She used to make comments like that all the time, about everyone. I grew up hearing it, thinking it was just how people talked. Harvey's expression softened further, recognizing the vulnerability in this admission. Generational patterns are powerful things, aren't they? We inherit more than just eye color and hairlines from our families. We inherit ways of seeing the world, sometimes ways that need examining. What happened next transformed the uncomfortable moment into something extraordinary. Instead of ending the exchange and returning to the safety of the game format, Harvey made a decision that would later be described by cultural commentators as a masterclass in transformative dialogue. "Let me ask you something else," Harvey said, his tone conversational rather than confrontational. "How does it feel standing here right now?" The contestant swallowed hard. "Terrible. Embarrassing. I wish I could take it back." "That feeling right there?" Harvey pointed to the man's chest. "That's growth happening in real time. That discomfort is your conscience catching up to your words." The studio audience, initially poised for drama and conflict, found themselves witnesses to something far more powerful. A genuine human connection forming across a divide that had seemed unbridgeable moments before. "Here's what I've learned in my 60-plus years," Harvey continued. "We all have blind spots. We all have things we need to unlearn. The question isn't whether we'll mess up. It's what we do afterward that defines us." The contestant nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm sorry. Really sorry." Harvey extended his hand, an offer of reconciliation that seemed to physically release the tension in the room. As they shook hands, something remarkable happened. The audience, without prompting, rose to their feet in a standing ovation that wasn't just for Harvey's grace, but for the raw authenticity of the moment they'd witnessed. Production assistants were openly wiping away tears. The contestants' family members embraced each other, their relief palpable. Even the normally stoic camera operators were visibly moved. The network executives watching the live feed from their offices sat in stunned silence. What had begun as a potential PR disaster was transforming before their eyes into something unprecedented in daytime television. A genuine moment of human growth captured in real time. "So here's what we're going to do," Harvey announced, his showman's instinct returning as he sensed the need to transition back to the game. "We're going to continue this conversation after the show if you're willing. But right now, we've got a game to finish and money to win for charity. You good with that?" The contestant nodded gratefully, visibly lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The audience applauded again as Harvey returned to his podium, picked up his cards, and with his trademark smile declared, "Let's play the feud." But everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something far more significant than a game show. They had seen a moment of authentic human connection that transcended entertainment. A moment that would soon go viral for all the right reasons. By midnight, the clip had been viewed 17 million times. What began as an unscripted moment on a daytime game show had transformed into a cultural touchstone, sparking conversations in living rooms, classrooms, corporate boardrooms, and social media platforms across the nation. Harvey Moment was trending worldwide, with celebrities, educators, and ordinary viewers sharing their reactions to what many were calling 5 minutes that changed television. The following morning, as Harvey arrived at his radio studio for his daily show, he was greeted by a team already fielding hundreds of interview requests. Major networks wanted him for their morning shows. Late-night hosts were crafting monologues around the exchange. University professors were requesting permission to use the clip in communications and sociology courses. "I didn't plan any of it," Harvey confessed to his radio audience that morning, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who hadn't slept much. "Something just told me to meet that moment differently, to see the person behind the comment rather than just the comment itself." What Harvey didn't mention on air was the flood of personal messages that had been arriving since the episode aired. Parents writing to thank him for showing their children how to respond to prejudice with dignity. Teachers describing classroom discussions sparked by his approach. Former bullies confessing their own journeys toward greater awareness. Most meaningful to Harvey, though, was the message that arrived from the contestant himself. A lengthy email sent at 3 a.m. after what had clearly been a night of deep reflection. "Mr. Harvey," it began, "I've spent the night replaying our interaction and examining parts of myself I've never really looked at before. The easy thing would be to say I'm not racist, that it was just a joke. But you gave me the gift of honesty, and I owe you the same in return." The message went on to detail a childhood steeped in casual prejudice, a family environment where racial jokes were as common as dinner table conversations about the weather. The contestant described his dawning realization that what he had dismissed as just jokes had real consequences, not just for those targeted, but for how he had learned to see the world. "You could have destroyed me on national television, and nobody would have blamed you," the email continued. "Instead, you showed me a different path. You saw me as capable of being better than my worst moment. I don't know how to thank you for that, but I can. Promise you this, I'm doing the work now, starting with my own children and how I talk to them about differences." Harvey shared parts of this message, with permission, during a special segment of his radio show dedicated to the incident. The conversation that followed among his listeners became one of the most engaged broadcasts in the show's history, with call-in lines jammed for hours as people shared their own experiences with prejudice and growth. Meanwhile, at the network, executives who had initially feared a PR disaster were now facing a different kind of challenge: how to honor the authenticity of the moment without exploiting it. Offers were pouring in for special episodes, documentary features, and even book deals centered around the exchange. In a meeting that would later be described in industry publications as unprecedented, the network's president gathered the executive team and delivered a simple directive: "We're not going to commercialize this. No special episodes, no merchandise, no exploitation. Sometimes television captures something real, and our job is to respect that, not capitalize on it." 3 days after the episode aired, Harvey received a call that left even the veteran entertainer momentarily speechless. The president of a major civil rights organization was on the line, inviting him to speak at an upcoming national conference on racial reconciliation. "What you did in 5 minutes on a game show," the president told him, "accomplished more than some of our formal initiatives do in months. You showed that transformation doesn't always require grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes it just requires the courage to have an honest conversation." As Harvey hung up the phone, he found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. From a poor boy in Cleveland to a homeless comedian living in his car, to a game show host whose unplanned response to a hurtful comment had somehow touched a nerve in the national consciousness. He thought about his father, a coal miner who had taught him that a man's character was revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge. He wondered what his dad would say about all this attention for something that, to Harvey, had simply felt like the right thing to do in the moment. The contestant, meanwhile, was on a journey of his own. After discussing it with his family, he had made the decision to speak publicly about his experience. 6 months had passed since that pivotal moment on Family Feud. The media cycle had long since moved on to newer controversies and viral moments. Yet something lasting had taken root in the cultural conversation. In university courses on conflict resolution, in corporate sensitivity training programs, and in school anti-bullying initiatives. The Harvey method had become shorthand for transforming confrontation into connection. What began as an unscripted exchange on a lighthearted game show had evolved into a case study examined by sociologists, psychologists, and communication experts across the country. Steve Harvey sat in his dressing room at the studio, reviewing notes for the day's special episode. The familiar surroundings, the makeup station with its bright lights, The rack of colorful suits selected by his longtime stylist, the framed photos of his family, provided a sense of normalcy that contrasted with the unusual nature of today's taping. His production team had approached him weeks earlier with the idea, and after careful consideration, he had agreed. On one condition: it would be handled with authenticity, not sensationalism. No dramatic music cues, no manipulative editing, no manufactured tension to boost ratings. Just an honest conversation between two people who had shared a transformative moment in front of millions. Harvey glanced at his reflection in the mirror, noting the lines around his eyes that had deepened with age and experience. At 67, he had spent more than 3 decades in the public eye, navigating the complex terrain of comedy, race, and entertainment in America. He had weathered controversies, celebrated triumphs, and learned, sometimes painfully, about the power and responsibility that came with his platform. But nothing in his career had resonated quite like that unplanned moment 6 months ago. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "They're ready for you, Mr. Harvey," his assistant called, her voice carrying the respectful warmth of someone who had worked alongside him for years. As he made his way to the stage, Harvey felt an unusual flutter of nervousness. After decades in entertainment, very little rattled him anymore. But today was different. Today, he would be reuniting on camera with the contestant from that famous episode. The man whose casual remark about Harvey's skin tone had sparked an exchange that millions would later describe as transformative television. The stakes felt higher than any game show finale or comedy special he had ever hosted. The studio audience erupted in applause as Harvey walked onto the set. The familiar Family Feud backdrop had been replaced with a more intimate setting: warm lighting, comfortable furniture, and subtle colors that invited conversation rather than competition. After acknowledging their welcome with his characteristic warmth, he took a seat in one of 2 armchairs positioned center stage, a deliberate departure from the game show format that usually kept him standing behind his podium, separated from contestants by the physical structure of the game. "Today is a little different," Harvey began once the audience settled, his deep voice carrying the natural authority that had made him such an effective host across multiple shows. "We're stepping away from the game to continue a conversation that began 6 months ago on this very stage. A conversation that, thanks to all of you and the power of social media, became something much bigger than any of us expected." The lights dimmed slightly as screens around the studio displayed the now famous clip. Even though most viewers had seen it multiple times, it had been shared, analyzed, and referenced across every platform imaginable. The audience watched in reverent silence, many nodding in recognition of key moments: the initial comment, Harvey's pause, the approach to the contestant, and the conversation that followed. The clip captured not just the exchange itself, but the visible transformation in the studio audience, from uncomfortable tension to collective understanding. When the clip ended, Harvey turned toward the side entrance of the stage. "Please welcome back to our show, Michael Thompson." The contestant entered to supportive applause, looking noticeably different from his last appearance. Gone was the nervous bravado, replaced by a composed demeanor that suggested the past months had brought significant reflection. He wore a simple button-down shirt rather than the matching family t-shirt from the game show episode. His posture was straighter, his step more deliberate. The 2 men shook hands warmly before Michael took the second chair. "First of all, thank you for coming back," Harvey began. "I know this couldn't have been an easy decision." Michael nodded, adjusting slightly in his seat. "It wasn't. But it felt necessary. Not just for me, but maybe for other people who saw themselves in that moment, either as someone who's made hurtful comments or as someone who's been on the receiving end. Tell us about these past 6 months, Harvey prompted gently. What's happened since that day? Michael took a deep breath, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. It's been a journey of uncomfortable realizations. After our interaction, I couldn't stop thinking about what you'd asked me. Why I thought that comment was okay. I started examining other jokes I'd made throughout my life, patterns of thinking I'd never questioned. He described how the initial wave of social media attention had been overwhelming. The flood of messages, some supportive of his willingness to engage in the moment, others harshly critical of his original comment. For the first week, he had shut down his accounts, retreating from the unexpected spotlight. At first, I just wanted it all to go away, he admitted. I told myself people were overreacting, that it was just a joke that fell flat. But something you said kept coming back to me, about how comments that seem harmless to the person making them can carry real weight for the person receiving them. Michael described how, after the initial shock subsided, he'd reached out to diversity educators in his community, enrolled in workshops on unconscious bias, and most importantly, had difficult conversations with his family, including his children and the grandmother he'd mentioned during their original exchange. That was probably the hardest part, Michael admitted, emotion briefly catching in his voice. Telling my grandmother that the things she'd said throughout my childhood, things I'd internalized and repeated, had caused harm. She's from a different generation, and at first, she didn't understand why everyone was suddenly so sensitive. But we kept talking. Eventually, something shifted. Harvey nodded encouragingly, leaning forward slightly in his chair. Family conversations about prejudice are some of the toughest ones to have. What happened? She started sharing stories about discrimination she'd faced as an immigrant woman decades ago. Michael explained, emotion evident in his voice. How shopkeepers would follow her around stores, assuming she might steal something. How neighbors would speak slowly and loudly to her, even though her English was perfectly fine. Somehow she'd never connected that pain to the comments she made about others. It was like watching a light bulb go on. Now she's actually become the family member who calls the rest of us out when we say something thoughtless. The audience's laughter at this unexpected twist carried notes of recognition and relief. Several people nodded knowingly, perhaps seeing reflections of their own family dynamics. That's powerful, Harvey acknowledged. Sometimes we compartmentalize our own experiences of being hurt from the ways we might hurt others. Breaking down those walls isn't easy. Michael went on to describe other changes. Conversations with his children about the language they used at school, a workplace initiative he'd helped develop to create more inclusive communication, and the friendships that had deepened as he became more aware of how casual remarks affected people around him. The irony is, I've always considered myself a good person, Michael reflected. I donate to charities. I volunteer at my kids' school. I try to help my neighbors. But I was carrying these blind spots I never examined. That day on the show forced me to look at parts of myself I'd been comfortable ignoring. As their conversation continued, Harvey shared his own journey since that episode, the thousands of messages he'd received, the speaking engagements at schools and organizations, and his deepened commitment to using his platform for meaningful dialogue. What surprised me most, Harvey confessed, was how many people wrote to say they'd been Michael in that situation, the person making the hurtful comment without really thinking about it. They were grateful to see a path forward that didn't involve public shaming but still addressed the harm directly. He described one particularly moving letter from a high school teacher who had shown the clip to her students, sparking a classroom discussion that revealed several ongoing conflicts among teens who had hurt each other with thoughtless comments. This teacher told me that watching our interaction gave her students a vocabulary for addressing harm without escalating conflict. Several students actually apologized to classmates they'd hurt, initiating their own versions of the conversation we had. That's when I realized this wasn't just about one moment on a game show. It was about modeling a different way to handle these everyday situations that happen in schools, workplaces, and families all the time. The hour-long conversation moved beyond the personal to explore broader questions. How do we create spaces where people can acknowledge mistakes and grow from them? How do we balance accountability with compassion? What role do media and entertainment play in either reinforcing or challenging harmful stereotypes? Michael shared how his perspective on comedy and entertainment had shifted. I used to think people who objected to certain jokes were just being too sensitive. Now I understand there's a difference between humor that brings people together and humor that reinforces harmful ideas about groups that already face discrimination. The best comedians, including you, Steve, find ways to be funny without punching down. Harvey nodded thoughtfully. I've had my own learning curve with that. Earlier in my career, I made jokes I wouldn't make today. The goal isn't perfection, it's being willing to evolve. Comedy at its best should make people think while they laugh, not reinforce the walls between us. They discussed the challenge of having these conversations in an increasingly polarized society, where acknowledging harm can be misinterpreted as cancel culture and defensive reactions often prevent meaningful dialogue. What made our interaction different, Michael observed, was that you created space for accountability without shame. You didn't label me as a bad person. You questioned a specific behavior and invited me to reflect on it. That made it possible for me to hear you instead of just defending myself. As the segment drew to a close, Harvey turned to address the camera directly, his expression serious yet hopeful. What happened on our stage 6 months ago wasn't planned, and neither was what's happened since. But it's reminded me of something I've believed my whole life. Our most powerful moments as human beings often come when we're brave enough to step out of our comfortable scripts and truly see each other. He turned to Michael. I want to thank you for your courage, not just in coming back today, but in doing the harder work of examining beliefs that most people never question. Michael shook his head, a gesture of humility. I'm the one who should be thanking you. You could have responded to my comment in a way that would have ended very differently for me. Instead, you gave me something I didn't even know I needed, a chance to become better. As the cameras prepared to cut to commercial, Harvey offered one final thought to the audience, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had experienced both sides of prejudice throughout his life. People keep asking what the lesson was from all this. I think it's pretty simple. We're all works in progress. The question isn't whether we'll make mistakes. We will. The question is whether we'll have the courage to learn from them. The audience rose in a standing ovation as the two men embraced, a powerful visual reminder of how a moment of potential division had transformed into an unexpected bridge of understanding. As the applause continued, production assistants wiped away tears, camera operators smiled behind their equipment, and the viewers at home witnessed a rare moment of genuine human connection in a media landscape often defined by conflict and sensationalism. The director called for the commercial break, but neither Harvey nor Michael immediately moved to leave the stage. They remained seated for a moment longer, continuing their conversation even as the cameras stopped rolling. A testament to the authenticity of a connection that had begun in front of millions, but had grown into something that transcended the boundaries of entertainment. In the control room, the executive producer turned to her team. That, she said quietly, is why television still matters.